The storm had come without mercy. Savannah Clark stood at the edge of her porch, rain pounding against the tin roof, the wind howling like a wild beast. Her farm, her home, was drowning before her eyes. The floodwaters had carved deep scars into the land, fences torn apart like brittle twigs, crops submerged beneath murky torrents. And yet, despite the destruction, despite the weight pressing down on her chest, she stood tall. She had fought too hard for this place to let a storm take it away. But as she turned toward the barn, where the roof had started to cave, she realized she wasn't the only one who refused to back down. A truck rumbled up the mud-slicked driveway, headlights cutting through the relentless downpour. And then, out of the driver's seat, stepped Colton Hayes, a man who carried his own storms, a man who had no reason to stay. And yet, here he was. What neither of them knew was that this storm wasn't just about the rain. It was about fate, it was about second chances, and it was about a love that neither of them had seen coming. If you love stories about resilience, love, and finding light after the darkest storms, then this is the story for you. Make sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of this unforgettable journey. Now, let's step into Willow Creek and see what fate has in store for Savannah and Colton. The story begins now. Struggling single dad helps a farmer fix her flooded farmhouse, unaware. She owns one of the largest farmlands in the state. The sky was an ominous shade of grey, thick with storm clouds that had overstayed their welcome. The air smelled of damp earth and lingering rain, a grim reminder of the destruction the flood had left behind. Colton Hayes maneuvered his old Ford truck down the muddy back roads of Willow Creek, his hands gripping the wheel as he surveyed the damage. Fallen trees, collapsed fences, and waterlogged fields stretched for miles. Ellie, his 6-year-old daughter, sat in the back seat, her small fingers tracing shapes on the fogged-up window. "Daddy, do you think the animals are okay?" Colton glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his heart tightening. She was too young to worry about such things, yet life had made her grow up too fast. "I hope so, sweetheart," he said softly. Farmers know how to take care of their animals. He wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure, her or himself. After serving 10 years in the army and losing his wife in a tragic accident, Colton had grown accustomed to loss. But it was different for Ellie. She deserved stability, a home that wasn't just a temporary stop on their way to nowhere. The truck jolted as he hit a pothole, yanking him back to the present. Up ahead, a small farmhouse stood resilient against the storm's aftermath. The white siding was streaked with mud, and the porch steps had partially caved in. A broken-down barn stood nearby, its doors barely hanging on their hinges. A lone figure was outside, struggling with a large wooden beam, her boots sinking into the mud as she fought to clear the wreckage. Colton slowed the truck. "Stay here, Ellie," he said, reaching for his rain jacket. "I'll be right back." He stepped out into the thick, humid air, his boots sinking into the wet ground with a squelch. As he approached, the woman turned, wiping sweat and dirt from her forehead. She was younger than he expected, probably in her early 30s. Her auburn hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, damp tendrils clinging to her flushed cheeks. She wore a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing arms toned from years of hard work. Despite the exhaustion evident in her deep green eyes, she stood with a quiet strength. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. Colton raised his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Just passing through. Saw you struggling with that beam." He nodded toward the wreckage. "Could use an extra set of hands." She hesitated, eyes scanning him as if measuring his intentions. "I can handle it," she said, gripping the beam again. Colton watched for a moment before stepping closer. "I'm sure you can. But just because you can do something alone doesn't mean you should." She let out a frustrated sigh, but stepped back as he grabbed the other end of the beam. With a grunt, they lifted it together, maneuvering it away from the barn's collapsed side. Once the weight was off her shoulders, she exhaled heavily, wiping her palms on her jeans. "Thanks," she muttered. "Name's Colton," he offered, extending a hand. A pause. Then reluctantly, she shook it. Savannah Clark. Her grip was firm, her palm rough with calluses. She was a woman who had built her life with her own 2 hands. "You live here alone?" he asked, glancing at the house. Savannah's jaw tightened. "That's my business." Colton lifted his hands again. "Fair enough." He looked around at the wreckage. "This place take a bad hit?" She let out a dry laugh. "You could say that. The flood took out half my crops, destroyed my fencing, and left me with a barn that's one gust of wind away from collapsing." Colton whistled low. "Insurance gonna cover it?" She crossed her arms. "Insurance doesn't pay out fast enough when you need to feed livestock tomorrow." Something about the way she said it, pragmatic, resigned, struck a chord in him. He knew that kind of struggle, the kind that forced you to keep pushing forward even when everything around you was falling apart. A sudden cry from the truck broke the moment. "Daddy!" Colton turned to see Ellie leaning out the window, pointing frantically. A section of the barn groaned as the weakened structure began to tilt. Savannah's eyes widened. "The horses!" She took off running before Colton could react. Cursing, under his breath, he followed, sprinting after her as she reached the barn doors and yanked them open. Inside, 2 terrified horses whinnied, hooves skittering against the unstable floor. The walls creaked ominously, and Colton knew they had seconds, maybe less. He grabbed Savannah's arm. "You can't." She yanked free. "I'm not leaving." "Them," Colton swore. "Then we do this fast." Together they unlatched the stalls, coaxing the panicked animals forward. Savannah murmured soothing words, while Colton guided them out into the open. Just as the last horse cleared the threshold, the barn gave one final, deafening groan before collapsing inward. Savannah stumbled back, chest heaving. Colton steadied her with a firm grip on her elbow. For a moment neither spoke, their breaths mingling in the heavy air. Ellie ran up, throwing her arms around his waist. "Daddy, that was so scary." Colton rested a hand on her head. "Yeah, sweetheart, it was." Savannah exhaled shakily. "That was close." Colton nodded, his pulse still racing. "Too close." She looked up at him, something unreadable flickering behind her gaze. For the first time, she didn't seem so intent on pushing him away. "You saved my horses," she said quietly. "You saved them," he corrected. "I just helped." A long silence stretched between them. Then Savannah straightened her shoulders. "I owe you one," Colton smirked. "I won't say no to a home-cooked meal." To his surprise, a small smile tugged at her lips. "You don't strike me as the kind who takes charity." He shrugged. "I don't, but I also don't turn down good food." Savannah shook her head, but there was a hint of amusement in her expression. "Fine. Dinner. But after that, we're even." Colton wasn't so sure. Something told him this. Storm had stirred up more than just floodwaters. It had set something in motion, something neither of them were quite ready for, but ready or not, it was happening. And for the first time in a long time, Colton wasn't so sure that was a bad thing. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and the crackling sound of bacon sizzling in a pan filled the modest kitchen. The farmhouse, despite bearing the marks of the storm, exuded a warmth that had little to do with the food on the stove. Colton sat at the worn wooden table, his gaze flickering toward Savannah as she moved effortlessly around the kitchen. She was still in yesterday's clothes, her hair loosely tied back, a few strands falling over her face. There was something about the way she carried herself, determined, self-sufficient, yet undeniably tired. She placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him, then set one for herself before pouring them both coffee. No cream, no sugar, she said, sliding his mug toward him. You seem like the type. Colton smirked. Good guess. Savannah sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her own mug. Silence stretched between them as they ate, not quite comfortable, but not tense either. Ellie, who had been sleeping, soundly after the excitement of the previous night, finally padded into the room, rubbing her eyes. She climbed onto the chair next to Colton, her small body still wrapped in her oversized hoodie. Savannah's expression softened. Hungry? Ellie nodded sleepily. Savannah grabbed another plate, serving the little girl without hesitation. Watching the interaction, something inside Colton eased. He wasn't sure why, but seeing Savannah care for Ellie, even in the simplest of ways, made him feel something. This place yours? He asked, breaking the silence. Savannah glanced at him. Yeah, been in my family for generations, Colton chewed thoughtfully. And you run it alone. A flicker of something crossed her face, something guarded. I prefer it that way. He wasn't convinced. Running a farm was brutal. Work, even with a full crew, let alone by herself. He recognized that kind of stubborn independence, the kind that came from years of learning to rely on no one. I get that, he said, taking a sip of coffee. But everyone needs help sometimes. Savannah gave him a pointed look. Not everyone can afford to ask for it. Colton studied her, noting the way she avoided his gaze, how her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her mug. What happened to the rest of your family? For the first time since he arrived, Savannah's expression hardened. That's not a conversation for breakfast. Fair enough. He had his own past he wasn't keen on sharing. Where's Ellie's mom? Savannah asked, turning the question back on him. Colton stilled. He should have expected it, but the question still hit like a punch to the gut. She passed away, he said finally, his voice quieter. Car accident, 2 years ago. Savannah's eyes flickered with something, understanding, maybe even regret for asking. I'm sorry. Colton nodded, not wanting to dwell on it. Yeah, me too. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, just heavy with things left unsaid. Ellie, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, swung her feet beneath the table. I like your house, she told Savannah between bites of toast. A genuine smile tugged at Savannah's lips. Thanks, it's a bit of a mess right now. Ellie shrugged. Daddy can fix stuff. Savannah glanced at Colton, one brow raised. Oh yeah? Colton smirked. Jack of all trades. She leaned back in her chair. So, let me guess. Ex-military, handyman and single dad? He met her gaze, unreadable. Something like that. Savannah exhaled slowly. You're a hard guy to pin down, Colton Hayes. He chuckled. I could say the same about you. Another stretch of silence. Then Savannah glanced at the window, where the damage to the barn was still painfully visible. I need to rebuild, she said, almost to herself. Colton followed her gaze. You're gonna need more than 2 hands for that. Savannah hesitated. She was proud, he knew that much already, but she was also practical. I can pay you, she said finally. Not much, but enough. Colton shook his head. Not necessary, she frowned. I don't take charity. It's not charity, he said simply. It's a job. I'll help with the repairs. You cover meals and a place for Ellie to rest if she needs it. Deal? Savannah studied him, weighing her options. Finally, she extended a hand. Deal. Their fingers brushed as they shook on it, sending an unexpected jolt of something through Colton's chest. He ignored it. Savannah pulled her hand back, quickly, as if she felt it too. Well, she said, standing, hope you don't scare easy, because there's a lot of work ahead. Colton grinned. Lady, I've faced worse. Savannah gave him a look, half amused, half doubtful. We'll see about that. Colton watched her as she grabbed her boots and headed outside. The sun had begun to break through the lingering storm clouds, casting streaks of gold over the damaged land. Maybe, just maybe, this place was exactly where he needed to be. Colton had seen his fair share of hard work. Military life had conditioned him to push through exhaustion, to keep moving forward no matter how heavy the burden. But farm work, real, back-breaking farm work, was an entirely different beast. He wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped back, surveying the section of fencing he had just reinforced. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the damp earth into thick, clinging mud beneath his boots. Savannah stood a few feet away, hands on her hips, assessing his work with a critical eye. She had spent the entire morning working. Alongside him, hauling lumber, digging post holes, and fixing what could be salvaged. Despite the exhaustion written across her face, she hadn't complained once. "Not bad," she admitted, tilting her head slightly. Colton smirked. "Not bad. You're a tough critic." Savannah shrugged. "Farm work isn't just about making things look pretty. It has to last. Guess I'll have to earn my 5-star review." She fought a smile but didn't respond. Instead, she wiped her dusty hands on her jeans and glanced toward the house, where Ellie sat on the porch swing with a notebook in her lap. "She's a quiet one," Savannah observed. Colton followed her gaze. Ellie had been doodling for the past hour, humming softly to herself. "Yeah, she used to be more talkative, but after her mum—" His voice trailed off. Savannah didn't push. Instead, she bent down, picked up a small wooden stake and twirled it between her fingers. "She seems happy here," Colton glanced at her. "Yeah?" Savannah nodded. "Kids know when they're in a good place." Something about the way she said it made Colton wonder what her childhood had been like. Before he could ask, Savannah dusted off her jeans and grabbed a bucket of nails. "Come on, handyman. We still have a barn to stabilize before nightfall." They worked in tandem, Savannah giving short, precise instructions while Colton followed through. Despite her stubborn independence, she knew how to delegate when necessary. Hours passed in a blur of hammering, lifting, and reinforcing what the storm had tried to take from her. By the time they stepped back to admire their progress, the sky had begun to turn hues of deep orange and violet. Colton exhaled, rolling his stiff shoulders. "Remind me to never complain about my old job again." Savannah chuckled. "Told you farm work wasn't for the faint of heart." He glanced at her, noticing for the first time the way the setting sun cast a golden glow over her features. Dirt smudged her cheek, and a few strands of auburn hair had come loose from her ponytail, but she looked content, at peace even. Before he could dwell on that thought, Savannah spoke again. "Come on," she said, nodding toward the house. "Dinner's on me." Colton didn't argue. His stomach had been reminding him for the past hour that it had been far too long since breakfast. Inside, the farmhouse was cozy in a way that made him feel at ease. The scent of roasted chicken and fresh-baked cornbread filled the air, mixing with the faint smokiness of the wood-burning stove. Ellie was already at the table, her eyes lighting up when Savannah set a plate in front of her. "You made cornbread?" Ellie asked, her voice filled with awe. Savannah smirked. "Made it this morning before all the fun started." Ellie picked up a piece and took a bite, her expression instantly brightening. "This is the best cornbread ever," Savannah laughed. Glad to hear it, Colton took a seat, watching as Savannah filled his plate. He couldn't remember the last time someone had made him a home-cooked meal. "Careful," he teased, taking a bite. "If you keep feeding us like this, we might never leave." Savannah rolled her eyes, but there was amusement in her expression. "Just don't expect dessert," she quipped. "I'm too tired to bake after a full day's work." Colton smirked. "I'll let it slide this time." Ellie giggled, her small voice filling the room with warmth. For the first time in a long time, Colton felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Something dangerously close to home. After dinner, Colton found himself outside, standing on the porch with Savannah as the stars blinked to life above them. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and hay. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, breaking the silence. Savannah didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned against the railing, her gaze distant. "I did. Once," she admitted. "Thought about packing up and starting over somewhere else, but this place is in my blood. I can't walk away from it." Colton nodded. He understood the weight of history, of belonging to something greater than yourself. Savannah turned to him then, her green eyes searching his. "What about you? You planning on staying in Willow Creek?" Colton exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't plan on being here in the first place." He glanced at the house, where Ellie's laughter still echoed faintly from inside. "But maybe this is exactly where we need to be." Savannah held his gaze for a beat longer before nodding. "Maybe," she echoed. The air between them shifted, unspoken words lingering in the quiet night. Colton wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time he was willing to find out. Colton had just finished reinforcing the last beam in the barn when the low rumble of an approaching vehicle broke the quiet afternoon. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, and watched as a sleek black SUV rolled up the long dirt driveway. The contrast between the high-end vehicle and the rustic farm was stark, out of place, like a wolf stepping into a den that wasn't its own. Savannah emerged from the chicken coop, shielding her eyes from the sun as she took in the unfamiliar car. The moment recognition dawned on her face, her entire body tensed. Colton frowned. Whoever was in that car, they weren't welcome. The driver's side door swung open, and a tall man in an expensive navy blue suit stepped out, his shoes sinking slightly into the mud. He looked to be in his late 50s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, his posture rigid. There was an air of authority about him, the kind of presence that commanded attention without needing to raise his voice. Savannah inhaled sharply, her hands clenched at her sides. "Dad," she said, her voice carefully controlled. Colton's gaze flicked between them. So this was William Clark. The man studied the farm with a slow, measured glance before settling his cold, calculating eyes on Savannah. "This is what you've reduced yourself to?" he asked, his tone laced with quiet disappointment. "Scraping by in the mud, living like a common laborer?" Savannah's jaw tightened. "This is my home. This is a waste of your potential." William's gaze flicked to Colton, assessing him with barely concealed disdain. "And I see you found some interesting company." Colton met the man's stare evenly, refusing to be rattled. He'd dealt with men like William before, powerful, entitled, believing the world should bend to their will. He wasn't impressed. Savannah stepped forward, her back straight. "What do you want, Dad?" William sighed, shaking his head as if she were a petulant child. "I've come to offer you a way out, a chance to return to the life you were meant for." Savannah crossed her arms. "You mean the life you wanted for me?" Her father didn't flinch. "You belong in Clark Enterprises. You belong in a world where your talents won't be wasted on fixing broken fences and milking cows." His voice softened slightly, though it was clear he was a man unused to bending. "Come back, Savannah. Stop this foolishness." Colton didn't move, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight. He didn't know the full story, but he knew enough to see that this conversation wasn't about love. It was about control. Savannah exhaled slowly, her fingers digging into her palms. "I'm not going anywhere." William's expression hardened. "You're throwing away everything for this?" He gestured at the farm, his voice dripping with disdain. Savannah lifted her chin. "Yes, I am." A tense silence stretched between them. William's lips pressed into a thin line. "You'll regret it," he said finally, "and when you do, don't expect me to be waiting with open arms." Savannah didn't waver. "I stopped expecting." That a long time ago. Her father studied her for a long moment before shaking his head and turning back toward his car. Without another word, he climbed inside, the SUV's engine roaring to life as he sped back down the driveway, leaving behind only the cloud of dust in his wake. Savannah let out a breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. Colton stepped beside her. "That was fun." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "That was mild." Colton didn't push. He could see the tension in her posture, the way she was holding herself together with sheer force of will. Instead, he leaned against the nearest fence post, crossing his arms. "So," he said casually, "you're rich." Savannah snorted. "Not in the way that matters." He studied her for a moment. "Is that why you're here? To prove something to him?" Her gaze snapped to his, her eyes flashing. "I'm here because this is where I belong, not because of him." Colton held up his hands in surrender. "Just asking," she sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "Look, my father has spent his whole life trying to turn me into a businesswoman, into his heir. But I don't want boardrooms and corporate takeovers. I want this, my life, my farm, and I'll be damned if I let him guilt me into leaving it." Colton nodded slowly. "Fair enough." She looked at him then, her expression unreadable. "Does it change anything?" He frowned. "What? The fact that I have money, that my family owns more land than half the state. Does it change how you see me?" Colton didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached down, picked up a handful of dirt, and let it run through his fingers. "Money's just paper," he said finally. "This," he gestured to the land, "around them, this is real." Savannah studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any trace of insincerity. When she found none, she exhaled, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "You're a hard man to read, Colton Hayes." He smirked. "I get that a lot." Savannah shook her head, a small, genuine smile tugging at her lips. For the first time since her father's arrival, she looked at ease, and Colton, despite knowing he should keep his distance, found himself wanting to keep it that way. The sun had long since set, but Savannah couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch, arms wrapped around her knees, staring out into the darkened fields. The night was still, save for the occasional chirping of crickets and the distant rustling of trees swaying in the breeze. Normally the quiet soothed her, but tonight her father's words lingered like a stubborn weight on her chest. "You'll regret it." Savannah clenched her jaw. No, she wouldn't. She had chosen this life, her life. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need his money, but why did it still sting? A creak on the wooden porch broke through her thoughts. She turned to see Colton stepping out, his broad frame illuminated by the faint glow of the porch light. He had changed into a plain grey t-shirt and jeans, looking more relaxed than he had all day. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "You?" Colton shrugged, leaning against the railing. "Too quiet." Savannah arched a brow. "Too quiet? I thought soldiers liked the silence." He let out a low chuckle. "Silence is fine, but too much of it gives me time to think." Savannah understood that all too well. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in thought. Finally, Colton spoke. "You okay?" Savannah exhaled. "I should be, but somehow my father still has this way of getting under my skin." She shook her head. "It's like he refuses to believe I can be happy here." Colton studied her for a moment. "Maybe because he doesn't understand happiness the way you do." Savannah turned to him. "And how's that?" He met her gaze, his deep blue eyes steady. "Some people think happiness is power, success, control. Others find it in simpler things, things that actually mean something." He gestured toward the fields. "This place means something to you. Your father doesn't get that, and maybe he never will." Savannah absorbed his words, the tension in her chest easing slightly. Colton hesitated, then added, "You shouldn't let him make you doubt yourself." She let out a quiet laugh. "That easy, huh?" He smirked. "Didn't say it was easy." For a moment, Savannah just looked at him. There was something grounding about Colton, something steady. He wasn't the kind of man who said things he didn't mean, and yet... Savannah swallowed, suddenly unsure. "What about you?" Colton frowned slightly. "What about me?" She shifted, gripping her arms tighter around her knees. "You came here looking for work, but you never really talk about what you're looking for, not in the bigger sense. Is this just temporary for you?" His jaw tensed, his eyes flickering toward the dark horizon. "I don't know." Savannah's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" Colton exhaled, running a hand over his face. "It means I didn't plan on being here, didn't plan on sticking around. Ellie and we've been moving around a lot, trying to find a place that fits." Savannah's heart sank slightly. "And this isn't it?" Colton didn't answer immediately. He finally looked at her, his gaze conflicted. "I don't know what home looks like anymore, Savannah." His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I thought I had it once, and then it was gone." She understood that kind of loss, that kind of uncertainty. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt to hear. Savannah inhaled sharply. "So, what happens when you figure it out?" Colton hesitated. "I don't want to make promises I can't keep." A lump formed in Savannah's throat. She forced a smile. "Right." She stood abruptly. "It's late. We should get some rest." Colton frowned slightly but didn't argue. "Yeah, guess we should." Savannah didn't wait for him to say anything else. She turned and walked inside, her chest tight with emotion she didn't want to name. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but she knew one thing for certain. She had just made the mistake of wanting something from a man who wasn't sure if he could stay. The wind howled against the farmhouse, rattling the windows and sending a deep chill through the air. The weather report had warned of another storm rolling through Willow Creek, but Savannah hadn't expected it to arrive so soon, or to be this fierce. She stood by the kitchen sink, staring out at the darkening sky. The storm clouds, thick and ominous, churned like a living thing, swallowing what little daylight remained. Colton walked in, shaking droplets of rain from his jacket. "Barn's secure, and the animals are settled," he reported, running a hand through his damp hair. "But if this storm is half as bad as the last one, we might be in for a long night." Savannah nodded, gripping the edge of the counter. She wasn't worried about the rain. She wasn't even worried about the barn. What unsettled her was the growing distance between them, something neither of them had spoken about, but both could feel. Ever since their conversation on the porch, she had kept her guard up. Don't want something from a man who isn't sure if he'll stay. She had spent her whole life watching people walk away. She wasn't about to set herself up for that again. Ellie ran into the kitchen, her small feet thudding against the wooden floor. "Daddy, the wind is really loud." Colton crouched beside her, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "It's just a little wind, sweetheart. Nothing we can't handle." Ellie clung to his arm. "Can we stay inside together?" Savannah's heart clenched at the way Colton's features softened. For all his hardened exterior, when it came to his daughter, he was something else entirely. "Of course," he assured her. "We'll stay right here." Savannah cleared her throat. "I made some stew. Might as well eat before the power goes out." They gathered around the small dining table, the storm raging outside as the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. The meal was quiet, save for Ellie's occasional chatter, filling the silence with her innocent questions. "Miss Savannah," she said between bites, "do you ever get scared when it storms?" Savannah hesitated, then gave a small smile. "Not anymore." Ellie's wide eyes blinked up at her. "Why not?" Savannah's fingers curled around her spoon. "Because I learned that storms always pass." Colton looked up then, his gaze steady on her. For a moment, she thought he might say something. But he didn't, and that silence said more than words ever could. Later that night, the wind picked up, fierce and unrelenting. The old farmhouse creaked, the shutters clattering against the windows. Savannah sat by the fireplace, absently turning a mug of tea in her hands. Across the room, Colton stood by the window, watching the storm with narrowed eyes. She didn't want to ask, but she did anyway. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Colton exhaled, his shoulders stiffening. "I haven't decided." Savannah let out a bitter laugh. "That's as good as a yes." He turned then, his blue eyes dark with something unreadable. "It's not that simple." She set her mug down, standing. "No? Seems pretty simple to me. You're either staying or you're not." Colton's jaw clenched. "Savannah, no," she cut in, shaking her head. "You don't have to explain. I get it. You never planned on being here. You never planned on staying. And I was stupid for thinking you might." His eyes flashed. "You weren't stupid." Savannah swallowed hard. "Then why does it feel that way?" Colton stepped toward her, his voice low. "Because you're not the only one who's scared." She froze. "I lost someone once," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I know what it's like to build a life around someone, only to have it ripped away. And I can't go through that again." Savannah inhaled sharply. "So you're running?" He hesitated. Then, quietly, "Maybe." Her chest ached. She had spent so much time trying to prove that she didn't need anyone. But for the first time in a long time, she had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have something more. But Colton wasn't ready, and she wasn't willing to wait for him to be. She forced herself to nod. "Well, at least I know now." She turned and walked away before he could say another word. The storm outside raged on, but the real damage had already been done. The morning after the storm, the world was eerily quiet. The sky had cleared, leaving behind a crisp autumn breeze that carried the scent of wet earth and broken branches. But inside the farmhouse, the silence was anything but peaceful. Savannah moved through her morning chores with methodical precision, feeding the horses, checking the fences, surveying the barn for new damage. Anything to keep her hands busy, anything to keep her mind off the conversation from the night before. "You're leaving, aren't you?" "I haven't decided." She had been a fool to think he would stay. She caught sight of Colton near the truck, checking the tires as Ellie played with the farm dog nearby. He hadn't said much since last night. Neither had she. Fine. Let it be that way. She turned toward the storage shed, but a sharp sound cut through the quiet, a car pulling into the long gravel driveway. Savannah stiffened. Not again. The black luxury SUV rolled to a stop in front of the house, its polished exterior completely out of place in the muddy aftermath of the storm. Colton straightened, his expression hardening, as William Clark stepped out, looking every bit the powerful businessman he was. Savannah felt the anger coil in her stomach. "What now?" she muttered under her breath, wiping her hands on her jeans as she walked toward him. William's sharp eyes swept over the farm, taking in the damage with a barely concealed sneer. "I see the storm was unkind." Savannah crossed her arms. "What do you want, Dad?" His gaze flicked to Colton before settling back on her. "I wanted to give you one last chance to come to your senses." Savannah clenched her jaw. "We've been through this. I'm not going anywhere." William sighed as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Savannah, you don't belong here. You are wasting your time on this farm, on this life." And frankly, his eyes flickered toward Colton again, dismissive. "You are keeping company that does not suit you." Savannah's fists tightened at her sides. "You don't get to decide that." William's jaw tensed. "If you won't listen to reason, maybe you'll listen to reality." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded document and held it out to her. Savannah hesitated before snatching it from his hand. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, then froze. Her grip tightened around the paper. "You wouldn't." William's expression remained unreadable. "I already did." Colton stepped forward, his voice low and controlled. What's going on? Savannah swallowed hard, her hands trembling. My father owns the loan on the farm. Colton's eyes darkened. What? Savannah lifted her gaze to William, her voice dangerously quiet. How long? William adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit. For years now. You didn't think this farm was surviving purely on sheer willpower, did you? Savannah's pulse pounded in her ears. She had fought so hard to keep this place afloat, sacrificing everything to make it work. And all this time, her father had been waiting, holding the reins just out of reach, biding his time until she had no choice but to come crawling back. I haven't missed a payment, she ground out. No, you haven't, William agreed. But after the storm damage, you will. He gestured to the paper in her hands. And I'm no longer interested in waiting. Either you come back to the city where you belong, or I foreclose on the property. Savannah's breath caught in her throat. You can't do this. Oh, but I can, he said, his voice smooth as steel. And I will, unless you leave this nonsense behind and come home. A heavy silence fell between them. Colton's hands curled into fists at his sides. You'd take her home from her just to prove a point. William barely spared him a glance. This is not your concern. The hell it isn't, Colton snapped. You'd rather see this place rot than let her have it. William's expression remained cold. It's a lesson she needs to learn. Savannah forced herself to breathe, forcing down the lump in her throat. I won't go with you. William exhaled sharply. Then you'll lose everything. She clenched her jaw, willing herself not to break. Then I'll start over. William studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. I won't make this offer again. I don't want it, Savannah bit out. Without another word, he turned and climbed back into his car. The door slammed shut, and the vehicle kicked up a cloud of dust as it sped down the driveway, disappearing into the horizon. Savannah stood frozen in place, her heart hammering against her ribs. Colton turned to her. Why didn't you tell me? She let out a bitter laugh. What difference would it have made? It would have made every difference, he said, his voice tight. Savannah shook her head. It doesn't matter now. He's made up his mind, and I made up mine. Colton took a step toward her. And what's your plan? She lifted her chin. I fix what I can, I sell what I have to, and I fight for the rest. Colton exhaled, shaking his head. Damn it, Savannah, don't, she cut in, her voice suddenly raw. Don't try to fix this for me. This is my mess, my fight. Colton stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched, then softer. You don't have to do it alone. Savannah swallowed. Yes, I do. She turned and walked toward the house, leaving him standing in the dirt, watching as the weight of the world settled back onto her shoulders. Colton had never been the type to stand by and watch someone drown, not in war, not in life. And yet that's exactly what Savannah was doing. She was drowning, not in water, but in pride. In the sheer weight of trying to carry everything alone. It had been 2 days since William Clark had delivered his ultimatum. 2 days of Savannah throwing herself into work with a desperation that even Colton could see was unsustainable. She barely ate, barely slept. She was a woman on a mission to hold her world together with nothing but sheer willpower. And damn it, he respected that, but he wasn't going to let her do it alone. Savannah wiped sweat from her brow, standing back to assess the repaired section of fencing. She had been up since before sunrise, her body aching from hauling lumber and hammering nails. She had to keep moving, had to keep fixing what she could before the weight of her father's threat crushed her completely. But before she could reach for another board, a shadow fell across her. Colton. He stood with his arms crossed, blue eyes unreadable. You can't work yourself out of this, he said. Savannah exhaled sharply. Watch me. Colton didn't budge. You need help. She let out a humorless laugh. Help? You mean charity? No thanks. His jaw tightened. This isn't about charity, Savannah. This is about not being too damn stubborn to accept a hand when you need it. She turned away. I don't need saving. Colton took a step closer. No, you don't. But you do need a plan, and right now working yourself to the bone isn't one. Savannah spun around, her exhaustion finally breaking through. Then what do you suggest, Colton? That I just roll over and let my father? A win? That I walk away from everything I've worked for? No, he said, his voice steady. I'm saying we fight smart. Savannah stared at him, her breath coming fast. And what does that mean? Colton inhaled deeply. It means we figure out a way to save this farm. Together. Savannah's throat tightened. You don't owe me that. He stepped even closer, his voice softer now. It's not about owing you anything. Her heart pounded. For so long she had fought alone, had believed that if she let someone in, if she relied on anyone, they would eventually leave. But Colton was still here, and for the first time she wasn't sure she wanted him to go. They sat at the kitchen table that night, papers spread between them, loan documents, financial statements, everything Savannah had avoided looking at because the numbers were too damn overwhelming. Colton ran a hand through his hair, scanning the numbers. All right, worst-case scenario. If your father goes through with foreclosure, when does it happen? Savannah swallowed hard. 60 days. Colton exhaled. Okay, and how much do you owe? She hesitated. More than I can make in 2 months. He frowned, tapping a finger against the table. But not more than this land is worth. Savannah gave him a wary look. What are you thinking? Colton leaned forward. I think we find a buyer, one that isn't your father. Someone who won't rip this place apart. Savannah stiffened. You want me to sell? I want you to have options, Colton countered. You can't fight your father with pride alone. You need leverage. Savannah stared down at the papers, her mind racing. Selling wasn't part of the plan. She had spent years fighting to prove that this farm was hers, that she could run it on her own. But was pride worth losing everything? Colton's voice was quieter now. You don't have to decide tonight, but you do have to start thinking about what's best for you, not just what makes a point. Savannah swallowed, meeting his gaze. He wasn't just talking about the farm, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what that meant. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of freshly turned soil and fallen leaves as Colton stood near the barn, rolling his sleeves up. The past few days had been a whirlwind of hard decisions, long conversations, and exhausting work, but at least there was a plan in motion now. Savannah had reluctantly agreed to explore the idea of selling a portion of her land to raise the money she needed without caving to her father's control. But there was something else looming between them, something unsaid. Colton knew it, Savannah knew it, and sooner or later it was going to come to a head. He heard her approaching before she spoke, her boots crunching against the gravel, her steps lighter than usual. He turned to find her standing, a few feet away, arms crossed over her chest, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sunlight. You've been quiet today, she observed. Colton wiped his hands on a rag. Just thinking. She hesitated. About what? He met her gaze. About what happens next. Savannah looked away, exhaling slowly. Yeah, me too. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally she spoke again. I don't want to sell, she admitted, her voice quiet. But I don't want to lose everything either. Colton nodded. That's why you're making the right choice. You're keeping control of what matters. Savannah let out a soft, humorless laugh. Funny, I don't feel like I have control over much these days. Colton hesitated. Then before he could stop himself, he said the words that had been weighing on him for weeks. I don't want to leave. Savannah's breath hitched. Colton looked away, running a hand through his hair. When I first got here, I didn't think I'd stay long. Hell, I wasn't even looking for a reason to, but this place, Ellie, it's different. Savannah's throat tightened. Colton, he shook his head. I don't expect anything from you. I just needed you to know. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. You think saying that makes it easier? Colton met her gaze, his expression raw. No, but it makes it real. Savannah looked down at her hands, struggling to breathe past the weight of her emotions. She had spent so long guarding herself, believing that people left, that promises broke, that love was something fragile and unreliable. But Colton wasn't just saying words, he was showing her every day, in every way, that he was different. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to believe it. She stepped closer, her voice barely, above a whisper. "Then stay." Colton exhaled, something unreadable passing through his eyes, and then, without hesitation, he closed the space between them and kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was steady, like him, like them. Savannah melted against him, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt as the world around them faded into nothing but warmth, relief, and the quiet realization that she wasn't alone anymore. When they finally pulled apart, Colton rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough. "You sure about this?" Savannah's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "I think I've been sure for a while." And for the first time, in forever, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Autumn had settled over Willow Creek in full, painting the trees in deep reds and golden yellows. The farm, once battered by storms and uncertainty, now stood resilient, stronger, just like Savannah. She stood on the front porch, a warm mug of coffee in her hands, watching the first light of dawn stretch across the fields. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh earth and hay. The sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance as the horses grazed, their movements steady and calm. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. And for the first time ever, she wasn't facing it alone. Behind her, the screen door creaked, open, and she didn't need to turn to know it was Colton. His presence was steady, familiar now, a constant she hadn't realized she needed. He stepped beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jeans. "You're up early?" Savannah smiled softly, taking a sip of her coffee. "Couldn't sleep, too much on my mind." Colton studied her. "Good things," she exhaled. "For once, yeah." And it was true. Her father had made good on his threat. He had initiated foreclosure on the farm, expecting her to cave, to surrender to his will. But he had underestimated her. With Colton's help, she had found a way forward. Instead of selling the farm outright, she had partnered with a local cooperative, securing the funds she needed to pay off the loan while keeping ownership of her land. She hadn't just saved the farm, she had saved herself. Colton nudged her gently. "You did it." Savannah looked at him, warmth filling her chest. "We did it." He shook his head. "No, Savannah, this was all you." She studied him, the way the morning light softened the sharp edges of his face, the way his eyes held. Nothing but quiet pride. It had taken her a long time to believe in herself, to believe in this farm, but believing in him, that had come easy. Later that morning, Ellie ran through the fields, her laughter ringing through the crisp air as she played. With the farm dog, Savannah watched from a distance, leaning against the fence, her heart full. Colton came up beside her, resting his arms on the wooden post. "She's happy here." Savannah smiled. "So am I." Colton turned to her, his gaze steady. "You know, when I first got here, I thought this was just another stop along the way, another job, another temporary home." He exhaled, shaking his head. "But I was wrong." Savannah raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" He nodded. "Yeah. This place, Ellie, your home." Her heart swelled at his words. Colton reached into his pocket, pulling out a small weathered key. He held it out to her, his expression serious. Savannah frowned. "What's this?" he smirked. "That old cabin out near the ridge, the one I kept fixing up." She nodded slowly. "Well," he continued, "I was thinking maybe it's time. I stopped fixing places up just to leave them behind." He placed the key in her hand, closing her fingers around it. "Maybe it's time I stay." Savannah stared at him, emotions tightening her throat. He wasn't asking for forever, but he was choosing this. Choosing her, and for someone who had spent her whole life believing she had to fight alone, that meant everything. She reached up, cupping his face, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then stay." Colton's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "Gladly." And as he kissed her, the wind carried the last remnants of the past away, leaving only the promise of something new, something real, something worth holding on to. The farmhouse was alive with the sounds of laughter and music. Friends and neighbors gathered under the string lights, celebrating the first harvest since Savannah had saved the farm. Ellie danced barefoot in the grass, giggling as Colton spun her in circles, her curls bouncing wildly. Savannah stood near the porch, watching the scene unfold, warmth filling her chest. She had built this, not just the farm, but a life, a family. Colton walked over, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Told you we'd figure it out." Savannah smiled, leaning into him. "Yeah, I guess you were right." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Get used to it," she laughed, shaking her head. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting everything in a golden glow, Savannah knew, without a doubt, that the storm had finally passed, and the life she had fought so hard for was just beginning. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight aren't against the world, but against ourselves, our fears, our doubts, our past. But when we open our hearts, when we let people in, we realize we were never meant to fight alone. Home isn't a place. It's the people who choose to stay. And love, the kind worth holding on to, always finds its way through the storm. And that's the end of Savannah and Colton's journey, but maybe it's just the beginning of yours. Now, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story has traveled. Did this story resonate with you? What was your favorite moment? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey, if you love stories filled with heart, resilience, and second chances, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story. Your support means the world, and every like, comment, and share helps keep these stories alive. So thank you truly from the bottom of my heart for being here, for listening, and for believing in the power of a good story. Until next time, take care, stay inspired, and remember, sometimes the greatest love stories come after the storm. See you in the next one.